5 hours after Washington said it was over, it restarted. The celebration lasted one morning. Energy traders had already flipped positions. Trucking dispatchers were booking cross-border loads. Factory managers in Michigan and Ohio exhaled for the first time in weeks. Then Ottawa spoke. 2 words, and $900 billion started unraveling. Not acceptable. That's the entire statement. No diplomatic softening, no offer to negotiate. Canada read the White House plan, understood every word of it, and rejected it in public on purpose within the hour. Markets didn't wait for an explanation. Energy futures dropped, gains erased. 6 Republican phones lit up simultaneously. What did Canada see that Washington buried in the fine print? Go back 48 hours. One vote changed everything, 219 to 211. Congress, including 6 members of the president's own party, voted to strip the White House of the emergency authority it used to impose 25% tariffs on Canadian goods. 6 of his own broke ranks. That almost never happens. And the vote sent one clear message to every business, every supply chain manager, every logistics company on the continent. The tariffs are coming down. Prepare to move. Exporters started rerouting. Trucking companies rebuilt their schedules. Auto parts suppliers in Indiana and Ohio told their Canadian counterparts, "We're back online." The law had passed. The crisis was over. The White House had a different interpretation. Here's where it turns dangerous. They didn't refuse. Refusal is a confrontation anyone can see. This was something more calculated. They released a compliance plan. And buried inside the legal language, invisible to anyone not reading the footnotes, was a timeline that didn't match the law. Not immediate, phased, over months, on their schedule. Read that again slowly. Congress passed a law. The White House responded with a document that technically cited the law while replacing its core requirement with a multi-month delay they invented during implementation. That is not compliance. That is reinterpretation. In real time. In public. Daring Congress to stop them. Canadian energy producers saw it in minutes. Exports halted again. Shipments already staged at border checkpoints held. American buyers who had just called their Canadian suppliers to restart got a second call reversing the first. The tariffs aren't gone. They're just wearing a different name. Ottawa responded with one line that reset everything. This is not what was agreed. Why did Canada treat a compliance document as a new attack? Because it was. The trade fight just became something else entirely. When Congress passed that vote, they expected power to transfer. Executive overreach reversed. Normal trade restored. That's the constitutional design. What they got was a demonstration of how that design breaks. Within hours of Ottawa's rejection, emergency sessions were scheduled on the Hill. New legislation was already being drafted. Not about tariffs. About compliance, enforcement. What Congress does when a president reinterprets a law rather than execute it. Washington has split in 2. Congress, holding a 219-211 vote, demanding immediate implementation. The White House, controlling every enforcement mechanism, moving on its own timeline. And between them, the American economy absorbs the impact. Auto assembly lines pause reorders. Agricultural equipment manufacturers recalculate component costs. Energy utilities in the Northeast that had already adjusted their pricing models adjust them back. Canadian exporters aren't holding shipments because they want to. They're holding because nobody can tell them what the rules are. What happens if the president just keeps ignoring the law? No precedent resolves that fast. No court moves that quickly. And while the lawyers draft briefs, factories go quiet. But behind the political fight, Canada wasn't waiting. While Washington argued about constitutional authority, Ottawa was already making calls that had nothing to do with Washington. Not press conferences, not announcements, conversations, Canadian trade negotiators accelerating EU dialogue, energy ministers opening new pricing discussions with Pacific buyers, Canadian oil companies, very quietly, modeling what it would cost to build new pipeline capacity toward Atlantic export terminals. This is what decoupling looks like before anyone calls it that. The U.S. currently takes 75% of Canadian exports. That number has been treated as a permanent structural fact for 50 years. It's not structural. It's a habit built on trust. And habits break when trust breaks. For American importers, that shift looks like this. Longer routes, higher freight costs, extended lead times, supply chain redesigns that take years and cost billions. Industries that built their entire operating model on frictionless Canada-US trade are now running scenarios they never expected to run. The largest trading partnership on Earth, questioning whether it still makes sense. If the US and Canada economically decouple, who fills the space? That answer benefits exactly the countries you'd least expect. Congress moved faster than the White House anticipated. New draft legislation, circulating within 36 hours of Ottawa's rejection, closes every gap the White House used to delay. The language is surgical. Tariffs removed immediately. No phases. No presidential discretion on timing. No implementation conditions. Compliance verified within 72 hours or enforcement begins automatically. No room to reinterpret. No footnotes to exploit. No timeline to manufacture. The law says now. For every business watching this play out in real time, the paralysis is already costing real money. Capital investment decisions across North American manufacturing paused, cross-border joint ventures frozen, banks financing deals with any Canadian supply chain exposure, adding political instability premiums they haven't charged since 2020. And then, in a closed session on the Hill, someone says the word out loud for the first time: impeachment. Not a motion, not a plan. A question. If the president refuses a law, what tool does Congress actually have left? Constitutionally, one, the most disruptive tool in American political history. Could a tariff dispute actually end a presidency? The answer is no longer clearly no. The world was watching, and the world started moving. Foreign governments don't wait for American political crises to resolve. They adjust in real time. And what they were seeing, a U.S. Congress and a U.S. president in open institutional conflict over trade law, sent a single signal to every trade ministry on earth. American commitments are not stable. Within the week, signals begin emerging. New bilateral trade conversations between Canada and EU partners accelerated. Not announced. Accelerated. Mid-sized economies, the ones that have spent decades treating the U.S. market as the center of gravity, begin stress testing scenarios where that center shifts. Currency desks at major financial institutions quietly increase hedging positions against U.S. political risk, not panic. Prudence, the kind of prudence that, at scale, reshapes capital flows. And American exporters, the companies that depend on the U.S. being a reliable partner, start hearing something new from foreign buyers. Not hostility, something worse: hesitation. We'd like to keep working with you, but we need to understand your political situation better before we commit. That sentence, spoken in boardrooms from Toronto to Frankfurt to Seoul, is what the erosion of economic credibility sounds like up close. If allies stop relying on the U.S. market, what happens to American leverage? The answer takes years to fully appear, but it starts exactly like this. Now the math gets brutal. $900 billion in annual cross-border trade, that's not an abstraction. That's a real number attached to real things that real people buy, use, and depend on. Canadian oil makes up a significant percentage of U.S. refinery inputs, particularly in the Midwest, where refineries are physically configured to process Canadian crude. You can't just switch sources overnight. The infrastructure doesn't exist. So when Canadian exports pause, even partially, Midwest fuel prices move, not in 6 months, now. Fuel prices move, and then freight costs move. Freight costs move, and then grocery prices move. Grocery prices move, and it's not a headline anymore. It's Tuesday, and it costs more to fill your cart. Manufacturing feels it differently. Auto assembly plants in Michigan, Indiana, and Ohio run on just-in-time supply chains that cross the Canadian border dozens of times per vehicle. A single door panel might cross the border twice before it reaches final assembly. Every crossing is now a risk calculation. Plants don't shut down over this, not yet. They slow down, they build buffer inventory, they absorb costs, and eventually, if the uncertainty doesn't resolve, they make longer-term decisions about where to source. Some of those decisions don't come back. That's the 90-day scenario. That's what a trade dispute becomes when it gets entangled with constitutional conflict, and nobody can tell businesses when it ends. The biggest risk here isn't economic. The biggest risk is that nobody's in charge. Everything now converges on one window. 48 hours. Congress reconvenes. A new vote is scheduled. The legislation on the table is the most aggressive version yet, written specifically to eliminate every gap the White House used to delay, reinterpret, and phase what was supposed to be an immediate rollback. 3 outcomes are possible. Only 3. 1. The president complies. The tariffs come down on the original congressional timeline. Markets stabilize. Ottawa resumes normal trade. The constitutional confrontation recedes, but doesn't disappear. The precedent has been set. A president tested the limits. Congress pushed back. The line is now drawn somewhere new, and nobody fully agrees where. 2. The president refuses. Compliance is withheld. Congress moves toward enforcement. The legal battle enters federal courts. Businesses face months, possibly longer, of genuine policy uncertainty. Canadian trade diversification accelerates from option to strategy. The U.S. enters a period where 2 branches of government are simultaneously issuing conflicting instructions to the economy. 3. Someone uses the word that's already in the room: impeachment. Markets open tomorrow under conditions nobody predicted a week ago. Canadian Prime Minister Carney has not issued new terms. He has issued a verdict. What the White House proposed was not acceptable, and Canada will not move until the law is actually implemented, not reinterpreted. Energy futures are volatile. Manufacturing orders are frozen. Cross-border trucking companies are running 2 sets of projections, one for normal, one for extended disruption. And somewhere in Washington tonight, 6 Republican senators who voted against their own president are deciding whether they'll do it again. The trade dispute is not over. The constitutional question has barely begun, and the 48-hour window starts now.